Warriors of feudal Japan wielded weapons of unparalleled craftsmanship and lethality. These blades and tools, forged in the heat of battle and tradition, defined the rise and fall of empires. What brutal and legendary weapons did these warriors use to carve their names into history, feared by all who crossed their path? Here are the 15 most brutal samurai weapons from feudal Japan. Number 15. Ono Battle Axe. Have you ever seen a weapon so big it could cut a human being in half? For a weapon to be that big, it would have to be wielded by a giant or a superhuman. But the ancient Japanese were no giants, and neither were they super as far as we know. Yet somehow, they carried these weapons into battle. The Ono is a Japanese word for axe or hatchet, and considering its various forms, they were very formidable. From history book and records, the Ono can take various forms and sizes, but one thing we know is that they were used in battle by the Buddhist warrior monks. Although the sword was more of a trademark weapon for the ancient Japanese warriors known as samurai, axes were equally used. In the 20th and 21st century, Onos have been designed for less dangerous uses. However, in feudal Japan, they were designed primarily for warfare. The designs were different, but they all had one thing in common: a curved cutting edge and a wooden or metal handle. The curved blade sits on the long handle, and the entire weapon can be as long as 72 inches. The height of the Ono is not the issue here, but what it can do when wielded by a warrior.
To recreate an iconic weapon from history. The Japanese Ono.
In the heat of battle, an Ono could easily hack someone into pieces, a clear indication that it wasn't just sharp, but also dangerous. But that is not where it ends. Some of the battle axes had a bayonet attached to the head of the blade, making it easy to attack someone without having to get close to them. While most of the Onos had long handles, a few of them had shorter handles. These ones were probably used when the warriors needed to get close to their enemy for a more brutal and bloody combat. But despite the era this weapon was used in, it also signified a time when conflicts were resolved with bloodshed and brutality. The present day, Japanese may have gotten better in resolving their issues, yet the presence of these weapons is a reminder of their violent heritage. Number 14. Nodachi, Great Sword. When you think about a samurai, the image that comes to mind is a masked warrior with a katana or sword. While the katana has become part of the image of a samurai, the nodachi used to be the major part of the costume. A traditional samurai of ancient Japan, depending on his fighting skills and rank, wielded a nodachi or a katana. At first glance, the nodachi might be confused for a katana, but on closer inspection, you would notice the difference between the two. One of the key differences between the two is the length and use. The longer and more extensive nodachi was a very important weapon for the samurai in battles.
Draw cut. It is sharp to where it lacerated deep into this wild boar carcass.
For a sword to even be qualified as a nodachi, it has to be at least 5 to 7 feet long. This length gave its wielder an advantage in battle. It was usually carried on the back in a sheath, or simply held in hand. When in use, it had to be held with both hands. On the battlefield, anyone using a nodachi could cut through several enemies at once, and he would not have to get too close. Because of this, the nodachi was quite common in large battles that involved army formation. Think about the damage this sword could do in the hands of hundreds of infantry samurai marching against an enemy. They would sweep the fields and level the grounds before the cavalry steps in. The sword, although beautiful to look at, required expert skills to create and handle. Because of the long and curved nature of the blade, a special type of metal was used. Even then, the heating, cooling, and polishing process was a lot more complicated than regular swords. All of this was important because the blade had to be precise, sharp, and strong enough for combat. Sadly, the nodachi faded from use when spears and early guns became the go-to weapons for battle. Although it is no longer in use, the forerunner of the modern-day katana still remains one of the most formidable weapons in ancient Japan. Number 13. Kusarigama, Sickle and Chain. The samurai are not the only formidable fighters of ancient Japan. The ninjas are just as scary and dangerous, and their primary weapon was the Kusarigama. Basically, This weapon is a combination of a kusari and a kama. The kusari in this case is a metal chain with a weight on its end. Meanwhile, the kama refers to a Japanese sickle. In the fights between a ninja and a samurai, the Kusarigama was one of the weapons used in this bloody combat. On their own, these items can cause minor or grave injuries to a person. But in the hands of an expert of a deadly assassin, this weapon can do some serious damage when used together. The chain and the sickle are attached together at different points to work as a weapon, making it one of the most dangerous weapons to ever exist. They were used to launch short and long-scale attacks by ninjas. It is easy to imagine how this works, but seeing the injury it can cause is proof of its efficiency. In the hands of a fighter, the chain can be launched and wrapped around the opponent's head or weapon. This will allow the fighter to draw closer and deliver the killing blow with the sickle. The chain can also be pulled back by the wielder after launching, thus delivering the opponent directly into the hands of the wielder. In a similar way, the wielder can hold onto the chain and launch the sickle at the enemy, giving him the advantage of a long-distance attack. However it was used back then, the warrior could retract the chain at any time. This was very handy for warriors as they could take out several enemies from a distance. They were also high in demand in battles against enemies wielding swords or spears. Number 12. Tetsubo, Iron Club. While it is easy to picture the use of samurai swords and axes in battle, it is not so easy to picture the use of this weapon in a battlefield. With historical records telling us how Japanese warriors faced brutal battles, we can say this weapon was just for causing pain. The Tetsubo is basically a long iron or wooden pole with spikes. But when you think of the damage this weapon can cause, you might say it was reserved for people who enjoyed inflicting pain. In order to get a better understanding of what this weapon looked like, imagine a heavy baseball bat with lots of spikes coming out of it. The iron or wooden bar itself was shaped at the lower part to form the handle, and the upper and wider part had the spikes coming out all around it. This weapon may not have been used during battle, but it was very effective for other uses. Even if it was probably reserved for specific soldiers who could handle its weight. The Tetsubo was not associated with Japanese history until recently. The records show that these weapons were likely used by the Oni, or ancient Japanese demons.
What are we looking at? Yeah, these are giant war clubs used in Japan.
While the samurai and ninjas were bound by a code of conduct, the Oni were not. This meant they used this weapon on anything and anyone. Some reports also suggest that it was part of the weapons for a samurai. When it was needed, the samurai would use it to prevent damage to their katana. With its scary look, it is also possible that the Tetsubo was used as a torture device. The sturdy pole and the spikes made it perfect for smashing armor, horses' legs, shields, or bones of the enemy. The lower part of the weapon could also be used to pin someone against the ground or wall. The downside of this weapon is that the wielder had to be very close to their opponent to use it. This means that the said opponent must be incapacitated, or the wielder could risk being attacked too. But while the Tetsubo was very useful for attacks, it was difficult to control due to its weight. Regardless of its use, the Tetsubo remains one of feudal Japan's terrifying weapons. Number 11. Jitta Iron Truncheon. The samurai and the ninjas were not the only people who used brutal weapons in feudal Japan. The law enforcement agents were allowed to carry a weapon as well, and this was the Jitta. Often misspelt as Juta, the Jitta was a pronged blunt bar made entirely of iron.
Beautiful, simple, elegant, made of iron or steel.
It was used by the police to punish people who entered the palace of the ruler with a weapon. In feudal Japan, bringing a weapon of any kind into the palace was a crime. No one was excluded from this rule, not even the guards. In order to regulate this law, this 12 to 24 inches non-blade weapon was created for the palace guards. They not only used them to protect the ruler, but also to apprehend anyone who enters with a sword or any other weapon. While the Jitta was just an iron bar, its use depended on the owner's strength. It was a baton, but it was strong enough to block and even break a sword blade. Yet this was not the limit of its use. When used directly on a person, it can cause serious injury or fracture. making it a good tool for disarming people without permanently harming them. Eventually, it became a symbol of authority for law enforcement. Anyone seen with a jitta was immediately recognized as an officer of the law. From palace guards and police, the samurai also started using the jitta as a substitute for a badge. Depending on the rank of a samurai, the jitta can either be plain or decorated with inlays, or even a very small blade. With small guns and batons in use today, police and law enforcements, the jitta has faded from history as a weapon. Instead, it is used in some martial arts training and jujutsu classes. Number 10. Wakazashi, short sword. The Japanese samurai were known for stealth, precision, and agility. The katana was the primary sword of every samurai. But after a decree in the 15th to 17th century, all samurai were required to wear daisho. A daisho is essentially a pair of swords, one long and one short, and included the katana and the wakazashi. The katana, which was longer, had other uses, while the wakazashi was the shorter sword. The wakazashi was mostly a backup sword and was allowed indoors, unlike the katana. It was worn by attaching it to the side of a samurai's outfit. Additionally, it was used in battle to finish off enemies at close range after they had been struck the first time. But what was the major difference between the two swords? For one thing, the wakazashi had a sturdy and wider blade. Because the blade had more weight and was shorter than the primary katana, it could be used with one hand and in a closed quarter. Expert samurai reportedly used both weapons at the same time in battle, but they still had their individual uses. One of the dark uses of the wakizashi was to commit seppuku. As mentioned earlier, the samurai were bound by a code of conduct. When a samurai breaks the code, their punishment would be a ritualistic suicide with the wakazashi sword. Why is this interesting? Because like some Japanese folklore, the soul of a person is trapped in the sword that killed them. And because the sword can exist for hundreds of years, a sword can entrap the soul of more than one person. Think about it when you see a wakizashi sword lying around somewhere or in a museum. Number 9. Canabo, metal club. The Canabo closely resembles the Tetsubo, but after studying both weapons, it is easy to tell them apart. Like the Tetsubo, the Canabo was a metal club with spikes. The key difference here is that the Tetsube was made of iron or wood, whereas the Canabo was made of any kind of metal or heavy wood. Perhaps it is safe to say that the Tetsubo is a type of the Canabo. Also, the Canabo was wielded majorly by the samurai and was much longer than the Tetsubo. Another huge difference is that the Canabo was held by two hands when in use, while the Tetsubo was used with one hand. When we think about the size, the Canabo varied in size, with some being as long as 6 feet tall and more. The shape was also similar to a baseball bat, but the shaft could either be rounded or octagonal. For a weapon like this, the damage and pain it could cause depended on whoever wielded it. The club itself is controlled by momentum and stamina, hence it needs a significant amount of momentum to control its direction. Anything short of that, and the handler could be putting himself in danger. However, when swung, the force could shatter anything in its way. When compared to other weapons on feudal Japan,
Finished product, wooden Japanese Canabo. It is 4 pieces of hickory laminated together.
the Canabo was ranked side by side with a great sword. Number 8. Tanto, dagger. The Japanese samurai were and are still masters of the sword. From the long nodachi to the shorter and stouter wakizashi, each of their blades and swords are evidence of their expert swordsmanship. The Tanto is another lethal weapon of a samurai and is the smallest of all blade weapons. At just 5 to 12 inches long, this blade was used by trained samurai in close and deadly combat situations, like stabbing and slashing. Before the introduction of a Tanto to a samurai's personal arsenal, they only had to carry the katana along with them. But when it became more difficult to use the katana in enclosed spaces, there was need to create a smaller, more compact sword or blade. Unlike the katana that is double-edged, the Tanto is a straight, one-sided blade that was just as deadly. With assassinations and invasions by the samurai, the Tanto became widely adopted. It could be concealed easily within the clothing. Because of its compact size, women were also able to carry it for self-defense. But what makes it more dangerous than the longer swords? With the longer swords, The wielder has the advantage of reach and distance, but sometimes even this is not enough. Oftentimes, when the samurai needs to ensure their opponent is dead, the armor-piercing Tanto is used to deliver the killing blow by stabbing a major organ with as much force as possible. With the Tanto, silent and stealthy assassinations could be carried out either by throwing the blade or slashing as you move along. For a more sinister act, the short blade could be coated with a toxin that delivers the poison directly to the bloodstream of the victim. Without a doubt, the Tanto earned its place as a dangerous weapon from feudal Japan.
Tanto is a Japanese knife, basically, right? It's the Japanese samurai dagger.
Number 7. Nagamaki, long handle sword. It is easy to get confused with all of these swords and blades known to the feudal Japan. In present times, these swords may now be seen as ornaments and art pieces, but back then, they were symbols of the craft and skills of the Japanese samurai. Creating similar but different sword like the Nagamaki and the Nodashi required expert skills and experience. While the Nagamaki is similar to the Nodachi, the clear difference is the handle length. While the Nodachi has a long blade with a shorter handle, the Nagamaki has a long blade with a handle that is almost as long as the blade. Some records even say that the Nodachi was formed by cutting off the hilt of the Nagamaki sword. But one thing about the Nagamaki stands out, and that is its use. Generally, swords and blades were used by samurai, but the Nagamaki were specifically used by the footmen or infantry soldiers. The longer handle provided better grip on the sword and gave it a more balanced feel for sweeping across armors, shields, or bodies.
This is a Nodachi. But what is a Nagamaki, and how can you tell them apart?
Although some speculations say that the Nodashi is created from the Nagamaki, it is actually the other way around. During the Kamakura period between 1192 and 1333, the Nodashi swords were difficult to handle. Because of its very long blade, swinging and maneuvering was almost difficult. To fix this, a cord was bound from the middle of the sword to the point where it was attached to the handle. This provided a longer handle and better management. Eventually, longer handles were created for the long blades, and thus, the Nagamaki was born. The use of the Nagamaki was more precise, as the wielder had to use both hands in a particular stance, similar to a katana. Number 6. The Bento. This weapon is a unique one that is unlike anything anyone has ever seen. But when you look at it, you may wonder how best to describe it. Although it looks like a pole with a weird-looking blade attached to its end, don't let it fool you. The Bento is a polearm with a formidable and dangerous use. In truth, it does look like a pole with a sickle-like blade attached to it. But in battle, it is a very useful weapon that can save the life of its wielder. Basically, it is a curved, double-edged, thick, flattened blade attached to a spear or a long pole. The look and functionality sets it apart from the traditional blade or katana in feudal Japan. It might interest you to know that the concept for the Bento came from the use of poles and other long-range weapons in other parts of Asia. The Japanese adopted this concept and created the Bento to suit their military needs. Used in the wars and battles of Japan, anyone who had this weapon had a serious advantage over their enemies. Think of it as a spear with a much wider and sharper blade. With this, the handler could sweep against people far away from him and on both sides. This means you could attack and severely injure people in front of you without moving too much. The Bento, however, was useful both on the battlefield and outside the battlefield. Outside the battlefield, the Bento was and remains a symbol of strength and honor in Japanese culture. Similarly, it has become a major part of spiritual and martial arts training in Japan. Number 5. Naginata. The Naginata is known presently as a woman's sword, but it still remains one of the deadliest weapons of feudal Japan. In size and shape, there is very little difference between the Naginata and other samurai swords, especially the Nagamaki. However, it is the direct inverse of the Nodashi sword. In the Nodashi, the blade is much longer than the handle, whereas the Naginata sword has a longer handle than the blade. Although the handle of the Nagamaki is equally long, it is not as long as the blade attached to it.
So, here's the object in question. a Nagamaki made by Musashi.
This is why the Naginata stands out from other samurai blades. From the tip of the curved, double-edged blade to the edge of the handle, the Naginata can be the same height as an adult man. However, the handle takes up more than half of its length. But why is it referred to as a woman's blade? In feudal Japan, samurai were often away on battles and wars, and women were left to defend their homes. These women were left with these swords for their defense. The long handle made it easy for women to use and carry around. Also used on the battlefields, the Naginata kept the wielder out of reach of their opponents. The curved blade also made slashing a much easier task. Although the use of Naginata still exists today, it is restricted to tournaments and martial arts competitions. Still, it remains a relic passed down from the not-so-distant history. Number 4. Yumi. The katana may be the most famous samurai weapon, but the Yumi, or Japanese longbow, is an equally interesting weapon. Imagine firing a weapon from a distance of 200 meters. When trained very well, samurai could fire arrows from the Yumi from a distance of 300 meters or even more. The place of this weapon was unmistakable in battle. It could be used anywhere and from any height. In fact, it was better suited to high areas, as the shooter could hit their targets directly. One of the most interesting things about a Yumi was that it was taller than the person who used it. When measured, the Yumi could be as high as 3 meters tall, but it was not the height that made the difference when it was in use. Consisting of a pair of long, curved bows attached together with a very strong cord, the Yumi was accompanied by its arrow, called the Ya. The bow itself is made from laminating bamboo, wood, and leather to create a sturdy and strong bow. The string, also known as tsuru, was traditionally made of hemp. The design of the Yumi meant it had to be used in a specific way to achieve spotless aim for the shooter. For example, a tight grip of the string guarantees better aim than a loose grip. While modern examinations say that the Yumi was designed for a rider on horseback, others dispute it. Whether it was used on horseback, on foot, or atop a hill, it does not take away its place as a samurai's deadly weapon. Number 3. Yari. Better known as the samurai Yari, this weapon came in very handy for the samurai of the feudal Japan.
It's an authentic Japanese Yari, which is a lance.
The Yari is a blade attached to a long pole, and together they work as a spear or lance. The blade itself was anywhere from 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters or more, and varied in several forms. Some of the blades had a pointed tip, some had a small prong on its end, and others were simply straight with no edge or tip. The shaft of pole was usually made of bamboo or oak. This weapon worked just like a spear, attacking from a distance without giving room for close combat. However, they were also used sometimes in ceremonies outside the battlefield. But the history of this weapon is not one you might expect. In 1274, the Mongol attempted an invasion of Japan with long-standing spears. This would change the warfare of Japan into what it became in later years. After this, the Yari and other samurai weapons were produced to increase the chances of Japan in any battlefield. With the Yari being outdated, it is now stored in national museums, with the blade and the pole separated. Nonetheless, the stunning display of artistry is still a marvel. Number 2. Kama. As one of the components of the Kusarigama, the kama is just as scary and formidable itself. Just like the traditional sickle, the kama or gama is traditionally an agricultural tool. But when the need for it arises, it turns to a deadly weapon.
Who talks about the Kusarigama, and apparently it was neither a ninja weapon.
If you think the kama is a brutal weapon, imagine when it is wielded in twos. As a farming tool, it works well on its own, but as a weapon, the samurai used it in twos, one for each hand. On the farmland, it is used to harvest rice, wheat, and other tall crops. On the battlefield or in combat, however, it is a different story and not a good one. It can be launched at a target or used at close range for a brutal and bloody work. The curved blade makes a painful cut when it is latched onto one's skin and has to be pulled out. Safe to say it is no longer a go-to weapon for warfare in recent times. Number 1. Katana. Also known as dai in the Western world, the katana is the most well-known Japanese sword, and for good reason. The signature curved sword and intricate design stands out anywhere, but that is not where it ends. A katana is so sharp that in the hands of an expert swordsman, it can cut through several people in one swipe.
やっぱりこう喧嘩になってしまうので。
The curved blade makes a more efficient cut. A cut from a katana is so precise and clean that it still remains one of the most formidable swords. But among other swords, it was easier to carry, and this contributed to its present fame. Producing a katana is different from other swords, as the regular sword production cannot produce the curved blade of a katana. Wielded only by the elite samurai, the katana has become a symbol of honor and respect. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.